I want to first of all begin by thanking Mike for inviting me, Jennifer for recommending me. I'm surprised you remember me from one class in the middle of summer. The title for the talk tonight is The Hunger Games and the Gospel, or What Does Katniss Have to Do with Christ? And let me begin by saying, normally when I do these kinds of talks, I don't read papers because if I go to a conference, I don't like read papers. But I've written this paper in such a way that I hope it will come across well being read. I'm probably going to read most of it because I've got about 101 degree fever right now, so I need this to help me focus. So I hope you haven't come here expecting to hear an allegorical or typological reading of the Hunger Games novels, wherein characters are interpreted symbolically as representing Christ or Christian virtues such as faith, hope, love, etc., because that's not going to happen. That's not what I do. That way of reading, it seems to me, suggests that only works that allegorically or symbolically promote Christianity are worth reading. If you're interested, as an aside and off my notes, you'll see I do this a lot. If you're interested in that approach, just Google Christianity and the Hunger Games. You'll find plenty of articles and commentary that do that exact kind of thing. Okay? Rather, I want us to deal with the books as they were written and try to come up with what should be a Christian's response to or reason for reading them. The title for tonight's talk, The Hunger Games and the Gospel, or What Does Katniss Have to Do with Christ, is taken from a question asked essentially over 1,200 years ago. In the year 797, an Englishman named Alcuin of York, who served as advisor and teacher for Charlemagne in the cathedral school in Aachen, wrote another man named Hidbald. Hidbald was the abbot at the monastery at Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne is a small island off the northeast coast of England, just about an hour and a half south of Edinburgh. Lindisfarne means holy island. Okay? Alcuin wrote Hidbald a letter, and in that letter he asked a question. The question was, Quid Hinildus cum Christo? What does Ingild have to do with Christ? He wrote that because of some things he had heard about what was going on at the monastery. Ingild, by the way, is a famous Germanic hero who's mentioned in the Old English epic poem Beowulf. Pre-Christian, nothing to do with Christianity. Okay? Alcuin, in that letter, was lamenting that the monks listened to the harp at refectory, that is, during meal times, rather than listening to the lectionary, the readings of the Bible that were scheduled for that day, that they were listening to folk songs, okay, rather than sermons or lives of the saints or other holy religious works such as those. So, picture the setting. In one sense, the setting would be somewhat similar to what we have here, a large hall, okay? The difference would be not plush chairs, not a nice sound system. It would be dark and smoky. There'd be a fire in it. And you'd have a bunch of monks, okay, sitting around a table. And in the normal operation of a monastery at this time, you would have somebody standing off to the side at a lectern like this, and they would read, maybe from the Psalms, maybe from the Gospels, maybe from a life of a famous saint, maybe from the life of an Anglo-Saxon saint. That's not what was happening. Instead, these monks were sitting down to dinner and listening to tales of pagan Germanic heroes slaughtering their enemies. Okay? I mean, blood and gore and guts, the whole 9 yards. Nothing, quote-unquote, redemptive about it whatsoever. Alcuin was aghast. It blew his mind when he learned that. So, when he asked, what has Ingild to do with Christ? What he's really asking is, how can Christians benefit from pagan stories? Now, we can update that. Because, people don't really like to use the word pagan very much today. Unless you're a member of the MTSU Pagan Society, which we do have one. So what do these pagan stories have to do with Christ and Christianity, is what he's asking. Why should someone listen to a pagan story? For Alcuin, the answer was clear. These stories distract the true Christian from Christ, and they can be of no benefit. That's essentially what he said in his letter to Higbald. Now, got to get a little understanding. Alcuin's a deacon. Okay? He's also regarded pretty much as the smartest man in Europe at this time. But he's a deacon. Higbald is an abbot. That's a higher rank. So here you have a lower rank telling a higher rank member of the clergy, you need to clean up your act. Okay? So, the Christian, and maybe we should make this clarification, the Christian monk, because that's who Alcuin is writing about. Alcuin implies, should only listen to or read scripture, lives of the saints, sermons, those kinds of works. Okay? That letter was written in 797. Let's back up a few hundred years. Okay? Because Alcuin wasn't the first one to raise this issue, obviously. Over 400 years earlier, two major fathers of the church, one in the west, one in the east, okay, also wrestled with this issue. St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, okay, in North Africa, and Basil the Great, Bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia. In his Confessions, Augustine recounts, I don't remember which book and section, it's early, I didn't note it in my paper. In his Confessions, Augustine recounts how while reading Virgil's Aeneid as a youth, as a young man, he lamented for the death of Dido, the queen of Carthage. Okay? Yet, as he's writing the Confessions, he adds, he wept not for the death of his own soul. Okay, get the point there? He weeps for someone imaginary, fictitious. He doesn't weep for himself. When his soul, at that point in time, prior to his conversion, when his soul is prepared for hell rather than heaven. He chastises himself for loving the vain but beautiful images and ideas of the literature, even though the literature was ultimately nothing but lies. His words, he says this literature was nothing but lies. Okay? Because none of it had actually happened. There wasn't a real Aeneas. Aeneas was a fiction. He was fiction by another name, a lie. Now, hold on to that idea, the idea that fiction is nothing but lies. Because we're going to look at that tomorrow. We'll also discuss it a little bit later on tonight, because it's something C.S. Lewis said before he became a Christian. Okay? Augustine, thus, suggests in that passage, and I know there are other passages of Augustine where he does praise pagan literature, okay? But I'm focusing on this passage. Augustine suggests Christians should not read vain literature, but should instead read the scriptures. They should build up their soul, prepare themselves for what's coming, essentially. Basil the Great, however, takes another approach entirely. In an address entitled To Young Men on the Right Use of Greek Literature, and by Greek literature, he doesn't mean the Greek New Testament or the Greek Fathers of the Church. He means pagan Greek literature. He means the plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus and the poems of Sappho and all that wonderful material. He argues that much of pagan Greek literature focuses on the pursuit and application of virtue. And since the virtues come from God, Ryan's prayer said all truth comes from God. The virtues are forms of truth. Since the virtues come from God, those lessons should be emulated and applied in the lives of the young men, and we can say also young women. Because it is through the practice of virtue that one prepares one's life for the next life. Okay? So, Basil encourages his readers and listeners to read pagan literature, to find what is good and true and virtuous in it, and to attempt to emulate those virtues in their own lives. Because by doing so, what will happen? They will become virtuous, and they will thus prepare their souls for the death and resurrection in the next life. Okay? So, starting with Alcuin, jump back to the mid-4th century. Both Basil and Augustine are writing in the 350s. Now jump way forward. Now obviously I'm leaving an awful lot. There are many other writers we could look at to talk about whether or not a Christian should read literature. Dante, Philip Sidney, etc. Shakespeare. But jump forward roughly 1,600 years to 1931, Oxford, England. It's late at night, September 19th. And within a few short hours will be early in the morning of September 20th. 3 men are out for a walk. J.R.R. Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, and C.S. Lewis. J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson are confirmed, practicing, believing Christians. C.S. Lewis is not. He has become a monotheist by this point. He acknowledges God. Okay? It's an important point. They're discussing myth. They're on a place just outside Magdalen College called the Addison's Walk. Okay? It's a path that goes across the river. Goes along the river. There's a deer park on one side. Lewis's buildings that he lived in are on the other side. According to Tolkien's biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, Lewis claimed that myths were lies, though lies breathed through silver. I mean, just imagine that image, first of all. A lie, ugly, rotten, foul, and false, but breathed through silver. It's covered to be what? Beautiful, right? But they're still ultimately lies. Now, what kind of myths is he talking about? All myths. Germanic myth, Roman myth, Greek myth, Chinese myth, Indian, doesn't matter. Right? So as I said, by this time, Lewis had already come to accept God, but he hadn't quite accepted Christianity. Why not? Because he didn't see the relevance of Christ. Not today. That is, he couldn't understand what some Jew 2,000 years ago did had any importance for now, for us. Okay? In other words, he liked the story of Christianity as myth. He said, yeah, it's moving. Okay? So while they're on this talk, Tolkien kind of brings the discussion around to the Christian story, the Christian myth. And he and Dyson persuaded Lewis to see that when Lewis saw sacrifice in a pagan myth, the death of Balder in Germanic myth, the death of Adonis in Greek myth, he loved it. He valued it. It meant something to him. It struck him in here. All right? And yet when he saw that same myth, that same sacrifice in Christian myth, it didn't work on him the same way. Instead, he wanted to know. Is it true? That's all he wanted. He just wanted to know. It's almost like he wanted proof. You know, St. Thomas saying, unless I see him, put my finger in his hand, my hand in his side, I will not believe, etc. Okay? So what Tolkien and Hugo Dyson were able to do that evening, and we're never given an exact rationale how. That is, Lewis doesn't relate to us in Surprised by Joy, which is the autobiography of his early life, up and just past his conversion. He never tells us exactly what words they used. But what they did was they convinced him that the myth of the death and resurrection of Christ was different from the Balder and Adonis myth and other sacrifice myths because it really happened. That's the distinction. Balder is a lie. Adonis is a lie. Now in a few moments, we're going to talk about some stuff that Tolkien says, where Tolkien is going to imply they're not total lies. There are elements of truth in them. What's it like? It's like Wesley in The Princess Bride. You know, when he's mostly dead, he's not all the way dead. Okay? They're almost complete lies. But there is an element of truth in them. And what's that element of truth? It's that sacrifice. Okay? It's the death of somebody on somebody else's behalf that links them to the Christian myth. So, once Lewis kind of experienced the Christian myth from that perspective, that the story of Christ was myth and yet true, he fully accepted it. Okay? He accepted it, and he thought, in fact, it's the greatest myth. It's the myth that really happened. Later, he would call that, in a short essay, the myth became fact. Notice the difference in terminology there. Fact, that's something you can almost touch. It's real. A fact isn't something you can disagree with, such as, the factuality of this lectern being here. You can't say it's not here. Okay? So Lewis came to accept that factualness of the Christian myth. And in fact, he says that it's the myth that all people would really want to be true. Okay? The myth of the God who became man to reunite man with himself. And what he means by that is, it's the myth that everybody really desires. Even though most people don't even think about it. Okay? But, again, it differs from every other myth because of one thing. The man Jesus really lived, really died, really rose from the dead. It's the myth that becomes, Tolkien is going to say in his fairy story essay, embodied in human history. All right? Prior to this evening, to this walk with Lewis, Tolkien had written a poem to Lewis, which later gets titled Mythopoeia, which means myth-making. But the original title of the poem is Philomythos to Misomythos, lover of myth, or myth lover, to hater of myth, or myth hater. I'm going to read some, probably too long, some lengthy portions of this poem, and then I'll intersperse some comments with them, because they're pretty important for the overall topic that we're discussing tonight, and also to some extent tomorrow. I'm beginning, where I'm starting to quote, is a little ways into the poem. And this is the part that, if you've read Tolkien's essay on fairy story, this is the part that gets printed as the poem Mythopoeia. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single light to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of darkened light and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. Notice that. We create. Why? Because God is a creator, and we are made in his image. We create, Tolkien says, because we are sub-creators. We're not creators. Only God can create. Ex nihilo, out of nothing. We have to do what when we create? We have to take words and paper and paint and sticks and stones and other material and rearrange it. We don't get to make that other material out of nothing. So, Tolkien says, this is a right that we have. Whether used or misused, and I'll bet everybody in here could name a work that shows the right was misused. Or some aspect of, let's say, of human culture that shows that right was misused. But such abuse or misuse doesn't mean we turn our backs on the creative impulse and what it produces. Obviously, we could stop right here and say, well, this is the answer to Alcuin's question. Why should we read pagan literature? Because it's a product of being made in the image of God. It's a pretty powerful answer. Okay? But we're not stopping, obviously. Tolkien goes on. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. As an aside, have you picked up on what he's really talking about? He's talking about himself. At the time that he writes this, he's already 20 years, take it back, 15 years into the creation of the whole Middle Earth realm. He's been writing poems about Middle Earth since 1915. And this is about 1930, 1931. It is not they that have forgot the night, or bid us flee to organized delight, in lotus isles of economic bliss, forswearing souls to gain a Circe kiss, and counterfeited that machine produced, bogus seduction of the twice seduced. Such isles they saw afar, and ones more fair, than those that hear them yet may yet beware. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but oft to victory have turned the lyre, and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now and dark hath been, with light of suns, as yet by no man seen. Myth makers, such as Tolkien, Ian Lewis, and maybe even Suzanne Collins, and maybe even J.K. Rowling, have not forgotten the problems of real life, what Tolkien in this passage calls night, death, and ultimate defeat. But note how they respond to night, death, and ultimate defeat, or the pain, ugliness, and sin of life after the fall. Quote, they would not in despair retreat, but oft to victory have turned the lyre. Doesn't mean that they write stories about life in paradise, life in heaven, that just, grin and bear it through this life and everything will be better on the other side of Jordan. No. What are they doing? They're writing a victory before the victory is achieved. Does Katniss give up? No. Does Peeta? No. Does Finnick? No. Does Joanna? No. Does Harry Potter? No. I mean, pick your quote-unquote hero. Does Beowulf? I'm teaching Beowulf with my graduate students right now, so I've got Beowulf really on the mind. How about this? Those of you who know anything of Winston Churchill might have echoing in your minds some famous words of his. Yeah, I see somebody mouthing it. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. How's he finish? We shall never surrender. When does he deliver that speech? It's after Dunkirk. It's a week after he had gone to the House of Commons and said, I need to deliver a speech next week. Because the speech he thought he was going to be delivering was going to be one about an abject failure. He thought, when he asked Commons for the time to speak, that he was going to be talking about the deaths of tens of thousands of British troops at the port of Dunkirk in France. And yet what happened instead? You had the Royal Navy, you had the merchant seamen, and you had men and women in rowboats going across the English Channel and rescuing tens of thousands of men. It ended up, even though it was a retreat, being a total victory. And that's when he delivers his speech. He's saying, even in the darkest, we don't give up. Remember, Tolkien wrote the poem that I've been quoting 9 or 10 years before Churchill. Okay? Tolkien has this mentality. And by the way, it is ingrained in the English, this mentality. A little side note that's not in my notes at all. I hadn't even thought about it until just now. One of the times when I taught the Harry Potter course in London was July of 2007. It was the morning that we were supposed to catch a flight that day, 2005, that the London tube system was bombed and the transportation system. Okay? We flew over that day. We got there the next morning. We got there the morning after the bombings. Okay? This was my, 7th or 8th trip to London. London was a different place. It was a different world. Where before it would be impossible to see a policeman with a weapon other than a nightstick. Now you saw policemen walking abreast, 4 or 5 abreast, down a sidewalk, carrying semi-automatic weapons with their fingers on the trigger guard. You saw snipers on the roofs of buildings in downtown central London. Okay? But what you didn't see was a spirit of fear or cowardice. You heard little old ladies and little old men. Usually the little old men would be walking around wearing their World War II coats, who were saying things like, you think those little bombs are going to stop us? We killed Hitler. This isn't going to stop us. Okay? It's that idea of, you can hit us, but we're going to get back up. That victory, while it may not be present now, is still assured. Back to Tolkien. And these words are important for tomorrow, so if you're going to be here tomorrow, remember these tonight. I will not walk, I love this line, I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. That's us. We are the progressive apes, apes who progress and get better and better until we are sapient and erect. Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends, if, by God's mercy, progress ever ends. and does not ceaselessly revolve the same unfruitful course with changing of a name. I will not treat your dusty path and flat, denoting this and that by this and that. Your world immutable, wherein no part the little maker has with maker's art. I bow not yet before the iron crown, nor cast my own small golden scepter down. Well, what's he talking about? In one very real sense, he's talking about dystopian fiction. Fiction where people are what? Soulless. I'm going to talk tomorrow about George Orwell's 1984. And I'm going to read a couple of, not too lengthy, but somewhat lengthy passages that are by no means the most disturbing passages in the novel. But they are a bit disturbing because of the imagery that Orwell envisions for the future. Okay? Tolkien's talking there about realistic fiction, progressive apes, erect and sapient. In other words, what does that mean they lack? I already said souls, but what else? Compassion, love, humanity. At dinner, somebody mentioned something about realistic fiction. It's Catcher in the Rye. It's Holden Caulfield. What a sorry, miserable life. Notice what humanity, Tolkien says, is reduced to. The progressive ape. This is the view of modern man, prevalent in culture. And here, meaning academia. What are we reduced to in the university? And I say this as a university professor of 23 years. We are reduced to chemicals. Okay? That's all we are. We're a bunch of chemicals that's been kicked into life by some spark that we don't know how it began. And there are numerous scientists who are trying to figure it out. And where are these sapient and erect apes headed? To a dark abyss. Why? Well, Tolkien doesn't say it, but I will. Because they no longer acknowledge God. They no longer see where they've come from. And because they don't know where they've come from, they don't know where they're going. If you don't know your past, what do you also not know? You don't know your trajectory. Is this the world of Panem? Whether it's Panem or not, I don't know, we can talk about that. But I will say, with absolute certainty, it is the world envisioned by Philip Pullman, who wrote a series of novels called his Dark Materials, The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass. Okay? Because in that series, what Pullman postulates is that humanity is nothing but living matter. We have no soul. There is nothing after death but dissolution of your atoms. That's it. Okay? Obviously, what problem might that create for some people? And I'm being facetious there by some. What purpose does it give to life? What meaning does it give to life? Pullman, by the way, states in no uncertain terms, Satan is the hero because his novels are a retelling of John Milton's Paradise Lost, where Milton says at the outset, he needs to justify the ways of God to man. Little error in theology there, by the way, on Milton's part, as if God needs to be justified. I think it's the other way around. What Pullman is doing is he's saying Milton was wrong. God is the villain. It's God that needs to be killed. And he literally, in the course of the novels, kills God. Gives you an idea of what kind of God he thinks of. Back to Tolkien in the conclusion of the poem. Tolkien concludes the poem having advanced to paradise. So we've left this world behind, and we're now in the new heaven and new earth. In paradise, perchance, the eye may stray from gazing upon everlasting day to see the day illumined and renew from mirrored truth the likeness of the true. Then looking on the blessed land, 'twill see that all is as it is, and yet made free. Salvation changes not, nor yet destroys garden nor gardener, children nor their toys. What does he mean? Being saved, being in heaven, doesn't change the duty of the gardener. What must the gardener still do? Tend the garden. It doesn't change the purpose of toys. What does it do? It fulfills them. It completes them. It makes, as our resident philosopher said about Katniss, it gives the toys their ultimate full toyness. Their complete fulfillment in their essence of toyhood. Evil, it will not see. That is paradise, or the eye. Evil it will not see, for evil lies not in God's picture, but in crooked eyes. Not in the source, but in malicious choice. And not in sound, but in the tuneless voice. In paradise they look no more awry, and though they make anew, they make no lie. Pause there for a moment. Though they make anew, they make no lie. What's the lie he's talking about? Lies breathed through silver. He's saying, our human, because divinely inspired, creative impulse will not die when we die. Instead, it will be what? Like every other aspect of our nature that comes from God, it will be redeemed and completed and fulfilled. So those of you, if any of you are college students, you're writing your term paper, and your term paper up here is what? It's brilliant. Maybe you didn't have this experience. I always did. I thought it was brilliant up here. And then it comes down like this. Not as brilliant, especially when it comes back graded and all marked up and stuff. But in paradise, Tolkien is suggesting, it will be perfect. Be sure they still will make, not being dead. And poets shall have flames upon their head, and harps whereon their faultless fingers fall. There each shall choose forever from their all. So what does he mean? Poetry, myth-making, creativity will not cease in the world to come, because we, all humanity that makes it there, will still, quote, be made in the law in which we're made. We will still be sub-creators. Our being made in the image and likeness of God will be fully realized, achieved, and fulfilled in heaven, which means that all that we create, or sub-create, to use Tolkien's language, will be perfect. What does that mean? That means when an author writes a story, the person who reads it will perfectly understand. Because I don't know about you, but I often, when I read a story, I've got to read it a bunch of times. First of all, to make sure I'm following it, but then also is something being communicated to me? Am I picking up what the author is trying to say? So, how does all this relate to Alcuin and Katniss? I'm sure if Alcuin were alive today, he'd ask that same question that he asked of Ingvild. Quid Katniss cum Christo? What does Katniss have to do with Christ? Okay? He'd probably answer it the same way as he did 1,200 years ago, by the way. But let's put it for an audience of today. Why should Christians read or watch The Hunger Games or other works of culture / fiction? Obviously, answer depends on how you approach it. That is, how you approach that literature. Do you take those views I described earlier, the Augustinian and Alcuinian perspective? If it's pagan, it's bad. If it doesn't have Christ in it, it's not good, kind of a thing. Do you take the Basilian, the St. Basil the Great view? Find what virtue there is in it, strap that to yourself, jettison the vice that may be there? Or do you take the Tolkien and Lewis view and see that whatever the work is, it is somehow tied to, it is connected by a thread to the one great true myth? Before we go on, 3 more texts. These are short. 1 by Christ and 2 by St. Paul. That may help us not only understand the issue a little bit better, but it may also help us answer the question better. First, Christ's words regarding the disciples in his prayer to the Father in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verses 15 and 16. What does Christ say? I do not ask you to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. All right? Second, Paul's words to Romans, chapter 12. I don't believe in coincidence, but I do believe in serendipity. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Lastly, Paul's words to the Philippians, chapter 4, verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. Seems to me that first we must acknowledge that we are, as Christ says, in the world. We might not want to be. We might not like the world that we're in. Doesn't matter. As Gandalf says to Frodo, such questions are irrelevant. You have to deal with the ones that are given you. But we don't belong to the world. Huge, huge difference. Our true home lies elsewhere. We must still live and breathe and work out our salvation here. Among those who love us and among those who hate us. That means we must engage with this world. And that means engaging with the popular culture. We can't stick our heads in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist. Second, we must not let our minds and souls conform to the pattern of this world, because it's passing away. Rather, as St. Paul says, we must be renewed by we must be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So what does that mean? Well, we don't buy into cultural fads and movements we see in our society. We don't co-opt our beliefs and values and principles to be more acceptable to the world or culture. But how do you renew your mind? Well, what does St. Paul say in Philippians? Dwell on whatever is true, honorable, pure, right, lovely, of good repute, and anything excellent or worthy of praise. Now, obviously, that starts with, for Christians, reading Scripture, reading biographies of holy people, etc., reading theology, possibly, if you have a mind for it. But what else does it mean? It also means if we're going to be in the world but not of it, we engage with the culture but don't succumb to it. We don't give in to it. It means reading works of popular culture, watching films, television, but doing so critically. Having a critical mind means we examine and test what we read or engage with. We ask questions of it. We see, like St. Basil says, what truth and virtue we can glean from it. Is there anything in the Hunger Games, the Harry Potter novels, the writings of Lewis and Tolkien, the writings of Susan Cooper, Madeleine L'Engle, G.K. Chesterton, George MacDonald? You pick your authors. Is there anything in those works that's true, beautiful, lovely, pure? Go back to Philippians. If so, then dwell on those things. But what else do these words of Paul mean? Well, take that dictum in Philippians and turn it around. That is, rather than have it be all these positives, make it negative. So whatever is false, whatever is ugly, whatever is misshapen, foul, slanderous, lousy, or decrepit, what? Don't dwell on that. Run away as fast as you can. Flee it. Okay? Because what will that do? If virtue builds the soul, what does vice do? It destroys the soul. Completely aside from the Hunger Games, consider for a moment 2 films currently playing across the screens of America. One of them had been I believe, the #1 grossing film for the last 3 weeks, something like that. The other one is just now coming out. I've not seen either of these. I've not read the books either of these are based upon. I've read multiple reviews of both. American Sniper, about Chris Kyle, and 50 Shades of Grey. Based solely upon what I've read regarding the films and the books, it seems to me that one film and book emphasizes certain virtues and values, let's say, that Christians would praise and want to emulate. The other one, not so much. Instead, what does it do? It celebrates and glorifies hedonism and pleasure as the greatest good. The second film, 50 Shades of Grey, is replete with what is false, ugly, misshapen, foul, etc., and should not be dwelt upon. And I would probably say, for my own self, I'm not going to read it. I don't need to fill my mind with that stuff. And interestingly, another little side note, there was a thing somebody posted it to Facebook the other day, where both actors, the male lead and the female lead, said that they really didn't want people to see it. The woman said she did not want her parents or family or friends of her family to see it. The male lead said every night, every day after shooting, he had to go home to take a shower before he hugged his wife or held his baby son to wash the filth off. Now, that's a pretty damning indictment, it seems to me. Guys, keep in mind, that's make-believe. That's lies, not quite breathed through silver, I'd say more like lead, but you get the idea. But the first film, American Sniper, does what? It celebrates courage, loyalty, faith, honor, and in what context? The horrors of war. We don't have to agree with or support everything in the film. You might be a pacifist, but we can at least learn certain virtues from that film or book and try to live them out in our own lives, like courage under fire, or grace under fire, or honesty, or loyalty, or friendship. You could even take the film aside for a moment and look at Chris Kyle's real last moments. What was this man attempting to do? Anybody know? He was helping a fellow soldier, a Marine, who had also fought in Iraq and who suffered severe post-traumatic stress syndrome. And they were at a shooting range. And the guy turned his weapon on him and killed him. What was Chris Kyle doing? He was giving of himself, his time, the most celebrated sniper in American history. Okay? Was trying to help someone else overcome his demons from battle. And what did he get for it? Okay. Greater love is there than this? So let's go back to the Hunger Games for a moment. And consider it from the views we've discussed. How much time? That of Augustine and Alcuin, Basil the Great, Tolkien and Lewis. Okay? I think Augustine and Alcuin would probably say don't read it. After all, where is Christ in the Hunger Games? Literally. Where does the word Christ show up? It doesn't, ever. Where does the word God show up? It doesn't, ever. As preparation for this, I was doing some searches and reading. There is no form of any kind of religion anywhere at all in the Hunger Games books. None. Okay? It's been one of the big hang-ups some Christians have had about it. That even in a wildly dystopian society, you would still have this religious impulse, blah, 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 blah. Okay? I think Basil the Great would say, read it. If there's virtue in it, take that virtue, apply it to your own life. If there's other stuff in it that's horrible and rotten, discard it. It's unimportant. Do you want to live in a Hunger Games society? Do you want to play the Hunger Games for real? If not, then don't worry about it. All right? What else? I think Katniss's initial act in the first book tells us what we need to know about her. And I would suggest that first act carries through all three books. What does she do? Her little sister, 12-year-old Prim, has her name pulled for the Hunger Games. And Katniss substitutes herself. What is in her mind at that point, other than not Prim? What does she think is going to happen to her? She's going to die. Nobody thinks she's going to win. She's 14 years old. And she's going to be fighting 17 and 18-year-olds. Tributes from the well-fed districts. Trained warriors. That one act, to me, says much about not only her character, but also the character of the books themselves. That act of sacrifice shows us that the books are, to some extent at least, about living virtuously. Especially in the face of what? Look at her life in District 12. Overwhelming poverty, hostility, hatred. And yet, she can do what? She can still love. Yeah, I know, it's for her sister. Is her sister and her mother the only ones she loves? What does she, what agreement does she make with Haymitch? This is completely off my text. What agreement does she make with Haymitch in the second novel? Anybody remember? Save Peeta, not me. Peeta. Why? Because she says Peeta is good. Peeta is the one who deserves to live. She's saying there, I'm not the greatest person in the world. Peter is kind and compassionate and loving and giving of himself. Save him. Okay? They don't, obviously. So what else? Later we see Peter do the same when he volunteers for Haymitch. We also see Peter offer the burned bread to Katniss. Does he have to do that in that flashback? Why does he? What does he receive as a result of intentionally burning a loaf of bread at his parents' bakery? His mother beats him. Because when Katniss sees him the next day, he's bruised and battered. Why does he do it? Because Katniss is outside in the rain. And she has told us, the narrator's told us, if she doesn't get that bread, what's going to happen to she and her family? They'll die. That's the last thing they have. We could spend literally hours going and looking at little episodes of positive virtues in the books. But instead I want to look at, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think I've got 5. 5. And just one instance of each. Loyalty. Where do we see loyalty? How about when Katniss honors Rue and Thresh before the people of District 11? They're doing the victory tour and they go back around. Peter does what first? He says, we're going to give you guys 1 month of our winnings every year for as long as we are alive. Okay. He does that for Rue's and Thresh's families. What does that mean? They won't starve. Okay? What does Katniss then do? It's not like she's trying to one-up Peeta. It's because she sees Rue's family out there and she sees Rue's face in them. She says, Rue and Thresh didn't do what? They didn't let the capital, they didn't let Panem win. They played the games on their terms. What does she mean by that? Rue made Katniss an ally. Would Katniss have lived if it hadn't been for Rue? No. She would have died from the tracker jacker, the hornet-like thing stings. What about Thresh? He has Katniss by the throat and could kill her, but he lets her go. Why? Because he saw what she did for Rue. Mercy, compassion. She honors that to them, and what? How do the people of District 11 reply? They do this. And all hell breaks loose. Courage. How about when Katniss goes back to the cornucopia, the horn, to get what Peeta needs when he's injured? Remember, Peeta's like, no, you can't do that, Katniss. So what does she do? She drugs him. She knocks him out. She goes back by herself against overwhelming odds and gets what's needed. Kindness. So many we can talk about. How about when Katniss sits with Rue and sings to her as Rue is dying? Isn't she an open target when she does that? Yes, she is. And then what does she do? She buries her with the flowers. Love. Not only romantic love, as Katniss and Peeta come to know, but how about compassion? And this one you might think, well, that's kind of a weird sense of compassion. But how about in the books when Katniss ends Cato's life? Do you remember what is happening to Cato when she shoots him from the top of the cornucopia? He's being eaten by the mutts. Slowly. It goes on for hours before she finally kills him. She needs some sunlight in order to see him in the mouth of the cornucopia. but she can still hear him whimpering, and she uses her last arrow. Honor, the scene I discussed with Thresh, when he lets Katniss go because of how she treated Rue. We could go on and on. That's all the St. Basil kind of view. What about the Lewis and Tolkien view? We'll discuss a little bit, more of this tomorrow. But I think it's safe to say that whatever her theological or spiritual or religious beliefs, Suzanne Collins is clearly in line with what Tolkien talks about in that poem. And just as an aside, she's Roman Catholic. In her novels, what do we see? We see people confronting overwhelming odds, indeed certain defeat. But they don't give up. Look at the third novel, The Assault on the Capitol. You got 7 or 8 individuals with Katniss. And at one point she admits to them, President Coin never gave me authority to do this. And they go, we know. We knew you were lying from the beginning. But we're with you. Okay? And what do those individuals do? Think of Finnick. Think of Joanna. They sacrifice themselves so that Katniss can go on and achieve her goal, or what they believe is her goal. They fight on. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. To never give up. Even when she wants to give up. Does she? And I know we're going to disagree a little bit on this. Does she? Yeah, there are times when she falls down her face and I can't go on. And every time, what happens? She does. She goes on. She gets up. They want to make her the Mockingjay. They have the nice little script read out. She stands up there. I am Katniss Everdeen. I am the Mockingjay. And they realize it's horrible. They realize we need to put her out in the field. They send her to District 8, and what happens? She goes to that field hospital. And people see her. And they go, it's Katniss. It's Katniss. Katniss. And they reach up to her, and they reach out to her like she's going to heal them or something. But she doesn't. What is it they really want? I think this is really important. They want something or someone to believe in. Who do they have to believe in District 8? Nobody. And so she goes around to all those people. Is she the Mockingjay yet? No. What does it take to make her the Mockingjay? It's when they find out the Capitol Air Force is coming in for a strike. And do they come after Katniss and her troops? No. They hit the hospital. And she realizes the only way to stop what? Innocent people from being slaughtered is for her to step up to the plate. There's a famous quote attributed to the 18th, this is not my notes, attributed to the 18th century political philosopher Edmund Burke. All that is necessary for evil to thrive, anybody know how the rest goes? Is for good men to do nothing. All that is necessary for evil to thrive is for good men to do nothing. What has been happening in districts 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 since the beginning of Pan Am? They've been doing nothing. They've been paying the tributes, by which I mean sending them off to the games, rather than trying to stop an injustice. So, she fights on because she does see the injustice. She sees what happens when no one stands up and opposes President Snow. She's not Suzanne Collins. Is not writing or creating myth per se. I mean, people aren't going to believe in, Pan Am. There are actually people who believe, like a religion, in the Lord of the Rings. They believe elves are real, that Avalon, or the Blessed Isle is real. Kind of crazy, I know. But Suzanne Collins does see the true, the good, and the beautiful. And those are really what motivate Katniss and Peeta. Remember the game they play when they're trying to get Peeta back after he's been hijacked, his memories have been taken or bastardized? They play the true, not true, real, not real game. What's the ultimate memory that brings Peeta back? It's his love for Katniss. Okay? And it's not only romantic, it's compassionate, it's self-sacrificial. So in a word, what does Katniss have to do with Christ? My opinion, it's love. You see, it's not whether or not the author is a Christian, or whether the books are quote-unquote Christian, or whether they can be allegorized or interpreted to fit certain Christian ideas. I was talking at dinner with some folks. All kinds of Christians have read the Hunger Games and said, look, Peeta is a symbol of Christ. Why? Because he gives bread, and that bread is the bread of life. And others have said Katniss is a symbol of Christ because she's willing to lay down her life for others. She's not dead and resurrected, but Personally, I think that's unimportant. To me, it's about, is the story a good story and well told? First and foremost. And second, and this is where Lewis comes in a little bit more, what effect does the story have on me as a reader, first of all, but secondly, as a person? Does the story make me a better person by having read it? Am I more or less compassionate? Am I more or less virtuous? Does it help me to see Christ in other people, inasmuch as you have done it under the least of these? Or does the story make me less kind? Does it make me more selfish? In the last work he wrote, An Experiment in Criticism, C.S. Lewis suggested that there aren't good or bad books. He said there's only good or bad readers. I would quibble with him about that, by the way. And this is what he meant. How we approach a book. I don't mean, do you sneak up on it? I mean, how do you read it? If we approach a book as a tool to be used, as evidence to argue for or against something, then ultimately, Lewis says, we're bad readers. If our only reason for reading a book is to get information that makes me smarter, or that allows me to have an argument with somebody, or that I can use that information as a tool in some way, then I'm a poor reader. If, however, we open ourselves up to the book, and we allow the story to work on us, for the author to share his or her ideas with us, to use an image from Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, to create a little world in our mind that we can inhabit for a while and experience, then we're a good reader. Notice the distinction. The first kind of person does what? They do something to the book. The second kind of person lets the book do something to them. And it seems to me this approach follows most closely what St. Paul and Basil the Great are getting at. If there's anything in the book, good, true, beautiful, wholesome, honest, trustworthy, excellent, of good repute, etc., then think on those things. And I would say, There is much in the Hunger Games that fits that model. And if we read that and think on those things and learn from them, maybe, just maybe, as Ryan said in his prayer, we'll grow a little bit closer to God. Thank you.